The blood oath was broken the moment Lysandra stole the child from his mother's arms. 3 years. 3 years of lies woven so expertly that even the Alpha King himself, Alexandros, ruler of the Moonstone Pack and bearer of the ancient crown, believed his son was dead. 3 years since the royal decree had been signed in the heir's blood, naming him successor to a throne that stretched back 7 generations. 3 years since Callista, the Omega he loved more than his own breath, had supposedly failed to protect their forbidden bloodline. And it all began with jealousy so venomous it could poison an entire kingdom. But before we tear apart the lies that held this world together, tell me the city you're watching from so I can send you a hug. Because what you're about to hear will shatter every belief you have about love, loyalty, and the monsters we become when we want something we can never have. Lysandra had always been beautiful. The kind of beauty that turned heads in the great halls of the palace, that made warriors stumble over their words and nobles compete for her attention. Her hair fell like midnight silk down her back, and her eyes, those calculating amber eyes, could freeze a man's heart or set it ablaze depending on her mood. She was a beta of noble birth, daughter of the master of arms, raised in luxury and groomed for greatness. But she had never been chosen by Alexandros. That honor belonged to Callista. Sweet, gentle Kalista with her doe eyes and healing hands, an Omega from the lower villages who had somehow captured the heart of the most powerful Alpha in the realm. It was a scandal when their bond first formed, a fated mate connection that defied pack law and social hierarchy. The Council of Elders had nearly rioted. A king, they argued, could not bind himself to someone so far beneath his station. The bloodline would be weakened. The pack would lose respect. But Alexandros had been unmovable. "She is mine," he had declared before the entire court, his alpha command rippling through the throne room like thunder. Fated by the moon goddess herself. Challenge this bond and you challenge the divine. No one dared after that. Lysandra had watched from the shadows as Alexandros married Callista in a ceremony that brought together every pack within 1,000 miles. She had stood among the courtiers, her smile perfect and cold, as the Omega who should have been nothing became a queen. She had attended the celebrations, danced with visiting alphas, and drunk wine that tasted like ash in her mouth. And she had begun to plan. The pregnancy announcement came on the winter solstice, during the festival of the silver moon. Kalista stood beside Alexandros on the palace balcony, her hand resting on the barely visible swell of her belly, as fireworks exploded across the sky. The crowd below erupted in celebration. Heir. Finally, after 2 years of marriage, an heir to secure the Moonstone throne. Lysandra had clapped until her hands ached. She had smiled until her face hurt. And inside, something dark and desperate took root. Because if Callista could give Alexandros a child, a son the physicians predicted, then her place at his side would be unshakable. The bond between them would strengthen. And Lysandra, beautiful, accomplished, perfectly bred Lysandra, would remain exactly what she'd always been, invisible to the one man she wanted. She couldn't allow it. The months passed like torture. Lysandra watched Callista's belly grow round with life. She watched Alexandros become softer, gentler, his fierce warrior nature tempered by impending fatherhood. He would rest his large hand on Callista's stomach and speak to his unborn son in whispers, promises of the world they would explore together, the pack they would lead side by side. It was disgusting. It was unbearable. It had to end. Lysandra began collecting information the way others collected jewels. She learned the patterns of the palace guards, the routes of the servant corridors, the blind spots in the royal quarters. She befriended Callista's handmaids, offering sympathy and assistance, becoming someone trusted and welcomed in the queen's private chambers. She studied the ancient texts in the library, searching for laws and precedents, loopholes and traditions that might be twisted to her advantage. And she found exactly what she needed in a law that hadn't been invoked in over a century. The blood responsibility clause. Pack law was clear. If a royal heir came to harm through the negligence or failure of his guardian, that guardian would be held accountable before the council. If the harm was severe enough, if the heir was lost or killed, the guardian could be stripped of all rank and title, cast out from the pack entirely. It was a law designed to ensure the royal line was protected above all else. But it could be weaponized against the very mother meant to protect her child. The plan formed in Lysandra's mind like ice crystals growing on winter glass, beautiful, delicate, and sharp enough to draw blood. The night Callista gave birth, the palace erupted in jubilation. It was a difficult labor that lasted through sunset and into dawn, but when the baby's first cry split the air, every wolf in the castle howled in response. Son. Healthy and strong, with his father's dark hair and his mother's gentle features. They named him Niklos, after Alexandros's grandfather, a king who had united 3 warring packs and brought decades of peace. The royal decree was drawn up immediately, as tradition demanded. The infant's tiny handprint was pressed in ink mixed with a drop of his blood, the blood oath that bound him to the throne from his first breath. The document was sealed by the Council of Elders and locked in the vault of sacred records. Niklos was formally declared heir to the Moonstone Pack, protected by law and divine right. For 3 weeks the kingdom celebrated. Then Lysandra made her move. She waited until Alexandros was called away on urgent pack business, a border dispute with the northern territories that required his presence. He didn't want to go, hated leaving his new family, but duty demanded it. He kissed Kalista and his son goodbye, made Lysandra, his trusted friend, the daughter of his master of arms, promise to watch over them. Protect them, he had said, his hands on her shoulders, his eyes intense. Protect them as you would protect me. With my life, Lysandra had replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. It was the easiest lie she'd ever told. Alexandros left at dawn. By sunset, Lysandra had drugged Callista's tea with a sleeping compound so powerful the Omega wouldn't wake for 12 hours. By midnight, she had lifted the sleeping infant from his cradle, wrapped him in plain cloth to hide his royal scent, and carried him through the servant passages to the eastern gate. A carriage waited there, driven by a man Lysandra had paid handsomely, a rogue wolf with no pack loyalty and no questions. He took the child without a word and disappeared into the night, heading for a village so remote and insignificant it didn't appear on most maps. The woman who would raise Niklos as her own was a widow named Thea, childless and grateful for the orphan Lysandra had rescued. She believed the story completely, that the baby was the unwanted result of a servant's indiscretion, that he needed a quiet home away from the shame of the palace. She took him into her arms with tears of joy, promising to love him as her own. Lysandra paid her enough gold to ensure comfort for a decade, and made her swear a binding oath never to reveal the child's origins, an oath reinforced with subtle threats about what happened to those who broke confidence with nobles. Then she returned to the palace and set the second part of her plan in motion. The scene she created was masterful in its simplicity. She left the window in the nursery open wide, letting the night air sweep through. She scattered Callista's jewelry box as if someone had been searching frantically through it. She tore a piece of the queen's nightgown and left it caught on the window latch. And most critically, she took a small vial of blood, rabbit's blood obtained from the kitchen, and let 3 drops fall onto the nursery floor. Not enough to suggest murder. Just enough to suggest harm. When the palace woke to discover the heir missing and Callista still unconscious, the entire castle descended into chaos. Guards searched every room, every corridor, every shadow. Trackers were sent into the forest to follow any scent trail. Messengers were dispatched to alert Alexandros, to bring him racing home. And Lysandra, pale and shaking, told her story to the Council of Elders. "I heard a noise," she said, her voice breaking perfectly. "I came to check on the queen and found her unconscious. The baby was gone. The window was open." She pressed her hand to her mouth as if holding back tears. There was blood. Gods help us, there was blood. The elders examined the scene with grim faces. They noted the open window, the scattered jewelry, the torn fabric. They found the droplets of blood and drew the obvious conclusion. An intruder had entered through the window, attacked the queen or threatened the child, and fled with the heir. And Callista, who should have been alert and protecting her son, had somehow been rendered unconscious through the entire ordeal. The queen failed in her sacred duty, one elder announced, his voice heavy with judgment. The heir was taken while she slept. Pack law is clear on this matter. When Alexandros returned 3 days later, his kingdom was already turning against his mate. He found Kalista in their chambers, still weak from whatever had knocked her unconscious, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. She remembered putting Niklos down for the night. She remembered feeling suddenly exhausted, so tired she could barely stand. She remembered lying down just for a moment. Then nothing. Just darkness. And when she woke, her son was gone. "I don't know what happened," she kept repeating, clutching Alexandros's arms with desperate fingers. "I would never let anyone harm him. I would die first. You know I would die first." "I know," Alexandros said, but his voice was hollow. The bond between them, usually so warm and strong, felt strained. Not broken, never broken, fated mates couldn't break their bond, but stretched thin by tragedy and unanswered questions. The council convened within hours. Kalista was summoned to face their judgment, though she could barely walk, had to be supported by handmaids on either side. Alexandros stood at her defense, his alpha power radiating through the chamber, but even he couldn't argue against the physical evidence. The window, the blood, the missing heir, and Callista's inexplicable unconsciousness during the most critical night of her son's life. Lysandra gave her testimony with perfect sorrow. She described finding the scene, her horror at discovering the child gone. She met Callista's eyes across the chamber and let a single tear roll down her cheek. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I know this wasn't your fault, but the law is clear," the High Elder said. "While we do not believe the Queen intended harm, she failed to protect the heir. Whether through negligence or circumstances beyond her control, the result is the same. The child is missing, presumed." He couldn't finish the sentence. None of them could say dead. But the implication hung in the air like poison. "The blood responsibility clause must be invoked," another elder declared. "The Queen will be stripped of her title and rank. She will be removed from the royal quarters. And she will remain under house arrest until the investigation is complete and the heir is found, or his fate is confirmed." "No." Alexandros's voice was pure alpha command, the kind that made wolves drop to their knees. "You will not touch her. She is my fated mate, protected by divine bond. You have no authority." "We have every authority, Your Majesty," the High Elder interrupted, something no one else would dare to do. "Pack law supersedes even royal bonds when the heir's safety is concerned. This is not punishment, this is protocol. If you interfere, you call into question your own fitness to rule." The threat was clear. Challenge this and risk not just your mate but your throne. Alexandros looked at Callista, at his beautiful Omega who was trembling with shock and grief, and he felt something crack inside his chest. The bond between them screamed for him to protect her, to destroy anyone who threatened her. But his duty to the pack, to his people, to the laws that had governed them for generations. He couldn't destroy everything his ancestors had built. Not even for her. "Please," Callista whispered, reaching for him. "Please don't let them do this. I didn't fail him. I couldn't." But the guards were already moving forward, gently but firmly taking her arms. Alexandros watched as they led her away, every step like a knife in his heart, the bond between them thrashing with pain. And Lysandra watched from her place among the courtiers, her face appropriately sorrowful, her heart singing with triumph. The Omega was fallen. Now she just had to make sure she stayed down. The weeks that followed were a descent into darkness for everyone in the palace. Search parties scoured the kingdom, following every rumor, every supposed sighting of a missing infant. But Niklos had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. The tracker wolves found no scent trail past the palace walls. The forest revealed no secrets. Every lead turned cold. Alexandros aged 10 years in 10 days. The fierce, commanding Alpha became hollow-eyed and desperate. He led search parties himself, ranging far beyond pack territory, refusing to sleep or eat properly. The bond with Callista, strained by distance and circumstance, became a constant ache in his chest. Her pain feeding into his pain, his desperation feeding into hers, until neither of them could tell where their own emotions ended and their mates began. Kalista was confined to a small set of rooms in the eastern wing, far from the royal quarters. She was given food and basic necessities but stripped of all her jewelry, her fine clothes, her symbols of rank. The servants who had once bowed to her now avoided her eyes. The courtiers who had praised her beauty now whispered about her failure. She spent her days at the window, staring out at the forest as if she could will her son to appear. She spent her nights sobbing into her pillow, her omega nature driving her mad with the need to protect a child she couldn't find. The bond with Alexandros was her only comfort. She could feel him out there, searching, fighting, refusing to give up. But she could also feel his doubt growing. He didn't believe she had intentionally harmed Niklos. But had she been negligent? Had she somehow failed in ways she couldn't remember? The drugging suggested an attack, but no one could explain how an intruder had entered and left the heavily guarded royal quarters without being detected. No one except Kalista had been in the nursery that night. Unless she was lying. Unless her memory loss wasn't from being drugged but from something else. Well, he couldn't think it. Wouldn't think it. She was his mate. His fated bond. The moon goddess herself had chosen them for each other. But the whispers in court were growing louder. And Lysandra was the one feeding them. "I hate to say this," she told a gathering of noble ladies over tea. Her voice low and reluctant. "But I've been reading the old texts and there are cases, rare cases, where an Omega's protective instincts become confused. Where the stress of bearing an heir to such a powerful Alpha becomes overwhelming." The ladies leaned in, hungry for gossip dressed as concern. "There was a case 200 years ago," Lysandra continued, "where an Omega queen, overwhelmed by the pressure of her position, suffered a kind of break. She became convinced that her child would be safer away from the palace, away from the politics and the danger. She gave the baby to a servant in secret, then claimed he'd been stolen." "No," one lady gasped. "Surely you don't think." "I don't know what to think," Lysandra said, her eyes bright with false tears. "I love Callista. She's been kind to me. But she was unconscious for 12 hours, and no one can explain why. What if she took something deliberately? What if she wanted to seem like a victim while hiding what she'd really done?" The rumor spread through the palace like wildfire. Within days, even the servants were whispering it. Kalista hadn't failed to protect Niklos. She had deliberately hidden him, then staged the scene to cover her tracks. It was madness brought on by Omega instability. It was a betrayal of the worst kind. The council called another meeting. This time they didn't just question Callista's competence. They questioned her sanity, her loyalty, her very nature as an Omega deemed unfit for royal responsibility. Perhaps, the High Elder suggested carefully, the bond itself was a mistake. Perhaps the moon goddess was testing our king, and we failed by allowing this union to stand. It was heresy to question a fated bond. But heresy became acceptable when a kingdom was suffering. Alexandros stood before the council, his alpha power barely contained, and felt everything slipping through his fingers like water. "She is innocent," he said, but his voice lacked its former absolute certainty. "Then where is the child?" an elder demanded. "Where is your heir, your majesty?" 3 weeks of searching and not a single trace. Either he's dead, which would mean the queen failed to protect him, or he's hidden, which would mean the queen is guilty of far worse. There are other explanations. Name one that makes sense. Alexandros couldn't. That was the horror of it. Every scenario led back to Callista, either failing or lying, either incompetent or treacherous. And while his heart screamed that neither was true, that his gentle mate was incapable of such things, His mind couldn't construct an alternative that fit the facts. The bond between them began to fray. Not breaking, it would never break. Fated bonds couldn't be severed, but thinning, weakening under the weight of suspicion and grief. And Lysandra watched it happen with satisfaction that she hid behind a mask of concern. She visited Callista in her confinement, bringing tea and sympathy. "I'm so sorry this is happening to you," she said, setting the tray down on the small table. "I've been trying to speak in your defense, but the council, they're convinced you know something you're not saying." Callista looked up at her with hollow eyes. She'd lost weight, her omega nature suffering without her mate's constant presence and without her child's needs to fulfill. "I don't know anything," she whispered. "I wake up every morning thinking it's a nightmare. Then I remember it's real." "I believe you," Lysandra lied smoothly. "But belief isn't enough against pack law. You need proof. You need to remember something. Anything that could point to another explanation." I've tried so hard. But that night is just gone. One moment I was putting Niklos in his cradle, and the next I was waking up to guards and screaming and—" Her voice broke. "He was gone. My baby was just gone." Lysandra reached across the table and took Callista's hand, squeezing gently. Inside she was laughing. "Keep trying to remember," she said. "It's the only way you'll clear your name." But there was nothing to remember. The sleeping compound Lysandra had used was specifically chosen because it erased short-term memory. Callista would never recall drinking the drugged tea. Would never remember Lysandra's presence in her chambers that night. Perfect crime. A month after Niklos's disappearance, the council declared him dead. There was no body, no proof, but pack law allowed for such declarations after 30 days with no sign of life. A memorial service was held in the Great Hall, with the entire kingdom dressed in mourning white. An empty cradle was placed on a pyre and burned while wolves howled their grief to the moon. Alexandros stood at the front, his face carved from stone, his alpha power suppressed to almost nothing. He looked like a man who had forgotten how to feel. Callista wasn't allowed to attend. The Omega who had borne the lost heir was considered too shameful to participate in his memorial. She watched from her window as smoke rose from the pyre, and something inside her simply stopped. She stopped eating, stopped speaking, stopped responding to anything around her. Her Omega nature, deprived of her mate's full presence and destroyed by the loss of her child, began to shut down. The physicians told Alexandros she was dying. Slowly, inevitably, dying of grief and broken bonds and a soul that couldn't survive such trauma. "You must visit her," they urged. "Your presence might stabilize her." The bond is poisoned," Alexandros said flatly. "Every time I'm near her I feel." He couldn't finish. Couldn't admit that being close to Callista now brought pain instead of comfort, that the bond which should have been their greatest strength had become a weapon turned inward. Because he still doubted, still wondered, and those doubts infected everything. The council suggested separation, not rejection. An alpha could never truly reject a fated mate without destroying himself in the process, but formal separation. Callista would be sent away to a distant estate, given resources to live comfortably but removed from court. The bond would remain, but distance would ease the constant pain of it. "Think of it as mercy," the High Elder said. "For both of you." Alexandros stared at the separation decree for 3 days before signing it. The night before Callista was to be sent away, Lysandra visited her one final time. She found the Omega curled in her bed, turned toward the wall, barely conscious. The room smelled of sickness and despair. "Callista," Lysandra said softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Can you hear me?" No response, just shallow breathing. "I wanted to say goodbye," Lysandra continued, "and to tell you something. A truth you deserve to know before you leave." Still nothing. But Lysandra continued anyway, unable to resist the final cruelty. "Niklos is alive," she whispered. "Healthy and happy in a little village far from here. Took him. I drugged you and stole him and gave him away. I watched you fall apart, watched the kingdom turn against you, watched your mate begin to doubt you. And it was perfect. Every moment of your suffering was exactly what I wanted. She leaned closer, her lips almost touching Callista's ear. You took everything from me when you bonded with Alexandros. So I took everything from you. Your son, your position, your mate's trust. And soon, I'll have what should have been mine from the beginning. She stood, smoothing her skirts. Sweet dreams, Omega. Enjoy your exile. She was at the door when Callista spoke, her voice barely a whisper. Why? Lysandra looked back. Because I could. 'Cause you were weak. Because you never deserved him. She smiled. And because when they find out you've died of grief over a son who's actually alive and well, it will be the perfect tragedy. The mad Omega who broke rather than confess where she'd hidden her child. She left Callista there, broken and hollow, and returned to her chambers feeling more triumphant than she'd ever felt in her life. But she'd made one critical mistake. She'd underestimated what a desperate Omega mother could do. Kalista didn't die that night. Instead, something inside her reignited. Not hope. Hope was too gentle a word for what burned through her veins. This was pure rage. The kind of rage that only a mother whose child has been stolen can feel. If Niklos was alive, she would find him. If Lysandra thought she'd won, she would learn how wrong she was. And if the pack had turned against her, she would prove them all blind fools. But first she needed to survive. Needed to pretend continued weakness while she planned. Needed to make everyone believe she'd given up. So when the guards came the next morning to transport her to exile, she went quietly. Didn't fight. Didn't speak. Just let them load her into the carriage like a piece of broken furniture being removed from the palace. She caught one glimpse of Alexandros as she left, standing on a balcony high above. Their eyes met for just a moment, and through the bond she felt his pain, his confusion, his terrible doubt. Trust me, she tried to send through the connection. Please trust me. But the bond was too weak, too damaged by suspicion and distance. He turned away before she could be sure he'd felt anything at all. The carriage rolled through the palace gates, carrying Callista toward an exile that was meant to be her ending. Instead, it would be her beginning. Because 300 miles away, in a village called Thera's Rest, a 3-year-old boy with dark hair and his mother's gentle eyes was learning to read. His adoptive mother called him Miklos, close enough to his true name that he responded naturally. He was happy, loved, but he had his father's alpha power already showing in the way other children instinctively followed him. He had the royal bloodline singing in his veins, calling to a destiny that couldn't be hidden forever. And his true mother was coming for him. The months that followed Callista's exile passed like a dark dream for everyone left in the palace. Alexandros threw himself into ruling, becoming harder, colder, more ruthless. The kind king who had married for love was gone. In his place was an alpha who made decisions based purely on pack benefit, who showed no mercy to those who challenged his authority. The court whispered that he was broken, that losing both his son and his mate in one terrible month had destroyed something essential in him. They were right. But Lysandra saw opportunity in his brokenness. She positioned herself carefully, always nearby when he needed counsel, offering quiet support and political advice. She never overstepped, never pushed too hard. Just remained a steady, reliable presence in the chaos of his grief. The northern borders need attention, she would say, laying reports on his desk. And the treaty with the eastern pacts is up for renewal. Handle it, Alexandros would reply without looking up. So she did. She began taking on more responsibilities, attending council meetings in an advisory capacity, making decisions that should have been made by a queen or at least a high-ranking official. No one questioned it. With Callista gone and Alexandros half dead with grief, someone needed to keep the kingdom running. Within 6 months, Lysandra had become indispensable. Within a year, the courtiers had begun referring to her as the Alpha's right hand. Within 18 months, some of the bolder nobles began suggesting that perhaps, Once the required mourning period had passed, perhaps a new bond could be considered. Not a fated bond, of course, they would say carefully, but a political alliance. The kingdom needs an heir, after all. And Lysandra has proven her loyalty and capability. The idea took root. Slowly, carefully, but inevitably. Alexandros never agreed to it outright. But he also never refused. He seemed to exist in a space between life and death, going through the motions of ruling without truly caring about any of it. The bond with Callista remained, a distant ache he'd learned to ignore. She was still alive. He would know through the bond if she'd died, but she might as well have been a ghost. He never contacted her. Never checked on her welfare beyond ensuring the exile estate had adequate resources. He tried not to think about what that said about him. Meanwhile, in that exile estate on the edge of packed territory, Kalista had been planning. She'd arrived at the estate weak and broken, exactly as expected. The two servants assigned to care for her, an older couple named Damon and Talia, had been prepared for an invalid who would require constant supervision. Instead, within a week, they'd found themselves caring for an Omega with fire in her eyes and steel in her spine. "I need maps," Callista had told them on her 8th day there. "Detailed maps of every village, town, and settlement within 500 miles. I need lists of families who've recently taken in children. I need information on midwives, healers, anyone who might have handled an infant around the time my son disappeared." Damon and Talia had exchanged glances. "My lady," Damon had said carefully, the council believes I'm mad or lying. I know what they believe." Callista's voice was steady, cold in a way that shocked them both. "But my son is alive. I know this with every fiber of my being. And I will find him with or without help. But it would be faster with help." They'd help. Partly because they were loyal servants. Partly because exile guard duty was boring and this was infinitely more interesting. But mostly because after a week of living with Callista, they'd become convinced she was telling the truth. No one could fake the desperate determination in her eyes. No one could maintain such focused intensity if they were truly guilty of hiding their child. She wasn't searching for a baby she'd hidden. She was searching for a son who'd been stolen. Over the following months, Callista became an expert in quiet investigation. She couldn't travel herself. Her exile terms forbade it, and she'd be recognized immediately. But she could hire discreet trackers. She could send servants to gather information. She could compile data and look for patterns. She was searching for a needle in a massive haystack, but she refused to give up. And slowly, painstakingly, she began to narrow the possibilities. Villages where families had suddenly acquired children. Families with no previous record of pregnancy. Families who'd received unexplained financial windfalls around the time of Niklos's disappearance. The list grew, then shrank, then grew again. False leads and dead ends plagued her. But Callista pressed on, driven by a mother's instinct and a victim's rage. By the time her son was approaching his 3rd birthday, she'd identified 17 possible locations. Then 12. Then 8. One of those 8 was a village called Thera's Rest, where a widow named Thea had suddenly acquired a baby boy around the right time. Where that widow had, according to bank records Callista had bribed a clerk to obtain, received a substantial sum of gold just days after Niklos disappeared. Where a child now called Miklos was growing up healthy and happy, showing early signs of alpha power that made the village children follow him like a tiny pack leader. Callista stared at the report for 3 days straight, her heart hammering. The details fit too perfectly. The timing was exact. The unexplained money. The alpha traits in a child supposedly born to a beta widow. "This is him," she whispered to Talia, her hands shaking as she held the paper. "Gods above, this is my son. You can't know for certain without." "I know. A mother knows. This is Niklos." The question was what to do with the information. She couldn't simply retrieve him herself. She was in exile, powerless, her word worth nothing against the judgment of the council. If she tried to reclaim him without proof, she'd be accused of madness again. of inventing delusions to justify her previous crime. She needed evidence. Real, undeniable evidence of Lysandra's guilt. And she needed Alexandros to believe her. The bond between them was still there, still intact despite everything. She'd felt it every day of her exile, a thread of connection that never quite broke. He didn't reach out through it, didn't send warmth or reassurance. But it existed. If she could get to him, if she could make him listen for just one moment. Callista began to formulate a plan. A dangerous, possibly suicidal plan, but the only one she had. She would break her exile terms. Return to the palace during the lunar festival, when security would be chaotic and the crowds would provide cover. She would confront Alexandros directly, show him what she'd found, demand he investigate. And if Lysandra was there, when Lysandra was there, Callista would make her confess. One way or another. "This is insane," Damon said when she explained the plan. "They'll arrest you the moment you're spotted. The council will. The council can rot," Kalista said flatly. "I've lost 2 years with my son. I will not lose another day." The lunar festival was 3 weeks away. She used every moment to prepare. Back at the palace, Lysandra was preparing too, though for a very different purpose. The lunar festival was the perfect time to make her final move. 2 years of careful positioning, of proving her worth, of becoming indispensable to Alexandros and the pack. 2 years of slowly, subtly pushing the idea that he needed a new partner, a new future. The mourning period was officially over. Callista's fate was sealed, exiled for life, presumed too unstable to ever return. The fated bond might still exist, but distance and time had weakened it to almost nothing. Alexandros barely mentioned her anymore. Some days, Lysandra thought, he probably forgot she existed at all. It was time to offer him something new. During the festival's grand ball, before all the nobles and pack leaders gathered from across the realm, Lysandra would propose a formal political alliance. Not a fated bond, those couldn't be forced. But a chosen partnership, recognized by the council and blessed by the pack. She would become his queen in all but name, and eventually. Well, bonds could be buried under enough time and intention. Especially bonds that had brought nothing but pain. She had her speech prepared. Her dress was perfect, a deep sapphire that made her eyes glow like amber fire. Her hair was arranged in an intricate style that had taken her handmaid 3 hours to perfect. She looked like a queen. Soon she would be one. She stood in front of her mirror the night before the festival and smiled at her reflection. "You've won," she told herself. "Everything you wanted is finally within reach." She never saw the storm that was about to break. The lunar festival dawned with clear skies and the promise of celebration. The palace grounds were transformed into something magical. Thousands of silver lanterns hung from every tree, flowers bloomed in impossible arrangements, and the scent of roasted meat and honey wine filled the air. Wolves from every corner of the kingdom had traveled to attend, filling the courtyards and halls with music and laughter. It was the kind of celebration that made people forget their troubles, at least for one night. The kind of night where anything could happen. Callista arrived at the palace gates just after sunset, hidden beneath a hooded cloak that concealed her features. The crowds were thick enough that the guards were checking faces only casually. They were looking for weapons and threats, not an exiled Omega who should have been 300 miles away. She slipped through like a ghost, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. The bond with Alexandros pulled at her, stronger now that she was close to him physically. She could feel him somewhere in the palace, could sense his presence like a compass pointing north. But she also felt his emptiness, the hollow space where warmth and love used to flow between them. 2 years of separation and suspicion had eroded what should have been unbreakable. Please, she thought desperately, hoping somehow the bond would carry her plea to him. Please still believe in me. Please still love me. No response. Just that terrible emptiness. Callista made her way through the festival crowds, heading toward the palace's interior. She had Damon's maps memorized, knew which corridors would be less guarded during the celebration. She needed to reach Alexandros before anyone recognized her, before she could be arrested and dragged away. She needed just 5 minutes of his attention. 5 minutes to show him the evidence, to make him see the truth. 5 minutes to destroy Lysandra's perfect web of lies. In the grand ballroom, Alexandros stood on the raised dais at the front, looking every inch the powerful Alpha King. He wore ceremonial robes of deep black embroidered with silver thread, and the crown of the moonstone pack, an ancient circlet of silver and moonstone, rested on his dark hair. He looked magnificent. He looked miserable. Lysandra stood beside him, close but not touching, dressed in her perfect sapphire gown. She smiled at the gathered nobles, accepting their compliments and congratulations as if she were already queen. The whispers had been circulating for weeks. Tonight would be the night. Tonight, the Alpha would announce his new chosen mate. The High Elder stepped forward to begin the traditional festival blessing, his voice carrying across the crowded ballroom. We gather under the light of the full moon to celebrate the bonds that unite our packs, the strength that flows through our bloodlines, and the future we build together. Callista reached the ballroom entrance just as the blessing began. She stood in the doorway, hood still raised, scanning the crowd until her eyes found Alexandros. The bond between them suddenly flared with recognition. Even across the crowded room, even through 2 years of damage and distance, it recognized its other half. Alexandros's head snapped toward the entrance, his alpha senses zeroing in on something that shouldn't be there. His eyes widened as he caught her scent, unmistakable even beneath the hood, even after all this time. Callista. She lowered her hood slowly, meeting his gaze across the ballroom. Let everyone see. Let them all know she'd returned. The ballroom fell silent as people noticed her. Whispers spread like wildfire. It's the former queen. She's broken her exile. Guards, someone call the guards. But Alexandros raised his hand, and everyone froze. His alpha command rippled through the room, demanding silence and obedience. Let her speak, he said, his voice rough with shock and something that might have been hope. Kalista walked forward through the crowd, which parted for her like water. Every eye was on her. She looked thin, worn, nothing like the radiant Omega who'd once graced this ballroom as queen. But her eyes burned with purpose. She stopped at the base of the dais, looking up at Alexandros. I found him, she said simply. I found our son. The ballroom erupted in chaos. Shouts of disbelief, accusations of madness, demands for her arrest. But Alexandros's eyes never left hers. Explain, he commanded, and the room fell silent again. Callista pulled the papers from inside her cloak, the investigation reports, the bank records, the testimonies from villagers in Thera's Rest. A widow named Thea in a village called Thera's Rest. She received a substantial payment of gold 3 days after Niklos disappeared. She suddenly had a baby boy she claimed was an orphan. That boy is now 3 years old, with dark hair and alpha power already manifesting. She held the papers up. The dates match perfectly. The description matches. The unexplained money matches. Her voice shook but didn't break. Someone paid that woman to take our son and hide him. Someone who had access to that much gold and the ability to move through the palace undetected. Alexandros descended from the dais, taking the papers from her hands. His fingers brushed hers, and the bond between them sparked with electricity. Pain and longing and desperate hope all tangled together. He read through the documents quickly, his expression unreadable. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. This proves nothing, Lysandra said suddenly, her voice sharp. She'd recovered from her initial shock and was moving into defensive position. Documents can be forged. This is the desperate fantasy of an Omega who can't accept her failure. Kalista turned to face her, and the look in her eyes made Lysandra take an involuntary step back. I know it was you, Kalista said quietly. I know you drugged me that night. I know you stole my son and gave him away. And I know why. You're insane, Lysandra said, but her voice wavered slightly. Am I? Callista moved closer, climbing the dais steps. You loved him. You've always loved him. And when he chose me instead of you, it destroyed you. So you decided to destroy me in return. This is ridiculous. You visited me the night before my exile, Callista continued, her voice growing stronger. You thought I was too far gone to remember, too broken to understand. But I heard every word you said. She turned to address the ballroom. She confessed. She told me she'd taken Niklos, that she'd watched me fall apart with satisfaction, that she'd planned all of it. Lysandra's face went pale. You're lying. You were barely conscious. You couldn't possibly. You said, Niklos is alive. Healthy and happy in a little village far from here. I took him. Callista's voice rang out clearly. Those were your exact words. You told me you'd drugged me, stolen him, and given him away. You said I'd taken everything from you when I bonded with Alexandros. So you took everything from me. The ballroom exploded with shocked whispers. The High Elder stepped forward. Lady Lysandra, is this true? Of course not. Lysandra's voice was too loud, too defensive. She's making up lies to avoid facing her own guilt. There's no proof of any of this. It's the word of a disgraced Omega against mine. Then you won't mind if we investigate, Alexandros said quietly. His voice was deadly calm, the kind of calm that preceded violence. You won't mind if we send trackers to this village. If we examine your financial records from 2 years ago. If we question the widow about who paid her. Lysandra's eyes darted around the room, looking for support for escape. This is absurd. I've served this pack faithfully for 2 years while she... Answer the question, Alexandros commanded, and his alpha power rolled through the room like thunder. Will you submit to investigation? The silence stretched. Lysandra's mask was cracking, her carefully constructed persona falling apart under the weight of accusation and scrutiny. She looked at Alexandros, at the man she'd wanted so desperately that she'd destroyed innocent lives to have a chance with him. And she saw that he already believed Callista. The bond had decided for him. Fated mates recognized truth in each other, even through years of damage. And Alexandros was looking at Callista with dawning horror and rage. Not at her, but at himself for ever doubting her. Lysandra made a decision. If she was going to fall, she would take them all with her. Fine, she said, her voice suddenly cold and sharp. You want the truth. I took your precious heir. I drugged her, stole him, and gave him to some nobody widow in the middle of nowhere. And you know what? I'd do it again. The ballroom erupted in chaos again, but Lysandra kept talking, her voice rising above the noise. Do you know what it's like to be perfect for someone and have them choose someone lesser? To watch an Omega from nothing take what should have been mine by right of breeding, of intelligence, of capability. She laughed, high and bitter. I saved this pack. For 2 years I've been the one actually running things while he, she pointed at Alexandros, wallowed in grief. I've made the decisions, handled the politics, kept the kingdom functioning. I earned the position she was gifted just for being his fated mate. You stole my child, Kalista said, her voice shaking with rage. You let me be accused of negligence and madness. You destroyed our bond, our family, our lives. You took my future. Lysandra screamed. You took everything I'd worked for and planned for, just by existing. So yes, I took it back. I made you suffer the way I suffered. And if your son grew up happy with a mother who actually wanted him instead of being a political pawn, then I did him a favor. Alexandros moved so fast no one saw it coming. One moment he was standing beside Callista, the next he had Lysandra by the throat, lifted off her feet, his eyes blazing with alpha rage. Where? He growled, his voice barely human. Where is my son? Lysandra choked, clawing at his hand. Tithera's rest. The widow Thea. The boy she calls Miklos. Alexandros dropped her, and she crumpled to the floor gasping. He turned to the guards. Arrest her. charge her with treason, kidnapping of the heir, and conspiracy against the royal family. She's to be held in the deepest cell until trial. As the guards dragged Lysandra away, she laughed through her tears. It doesn't matter. You wasted 2 years. 2 years of your son's life gone. 2 years you tortured your mate with doubt. That's on you, Alpha King. That's your failure, not mine. The words hit like arrows because they were true. Alexandros stood frozen as Lysandra was hauled from the ballroom, her accusations echoing in the terrible silence. He'd doubted his fated mate. He'd let the woman he loved be exiled, accused, broken. He'd believed the lies because they'd been wrapped in logic and law and his own grief. And he'd lost 2 years with his son because of it. Callista swayed on her feet, the adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation suddenly draining away. Alexandros caught her before she could fall, pulling her against his chest. The bond between them roared to life, no longer suppressed or ignored, flooding them both with 2 years of accumulated emotion. Her pain, his guilt, their shared grief, the desperate love that had survived despite everything. "I'm sorry," Alexandros whispered against her hair, his voice breaking. "Gods forgive me, I'm so sorry. I should have believed you. I should have trusted the bond. I should have." "We need to get him," Kalista interrupted, pulling back to look at him. Her eyes were fierce despite the tears streaming down her face. "We need to go now. Tonight. I can't wait another moment." Alexandros nodded, turning to the High Elder. "Prepare a carriage. Fast horses. An escort of our best trackers." His voice was pure command again, the Alpha King taking control. "We leave within the hour." "Your Majesty," the Elder said carefully, "perhaps it would be wise to send representatives first to confirm." "I'm not sending representatives to retrieve my son," Alexandros said flatly. "We're going ourselves. Now." No one argued. The entire ballroom had witnessed Lysandra's confession, had seen the evidence that the lost heir might actually be alive. The kingdom that had mourned was now electric with desperate hope. Within an hour, a carriage thundered out of the palace gates carrying Alexandros and Callista, flanked by 20 mounted guards and the pack's best trackers. The journey to Thera's Rest would take 2 days at normal pace. They made it in one, pushing the horses to their limits, stopping only when absolutely necessary. Kalista spent the entire journey pressed against Alexandros, the bond between them repairing itself with every mile. They didn't talk much. There would be time for words later, time for apologies and forgiveness and healing. Right now, there was only the desperate need to reach their son. "What if he doesn't remember me?" Callista whispered as dawn broke on the second day. "He was only 3 months old when. What if he doesn't know me?" "He'll know you," Alexandros said with absolute certainty. "Blood recognizes blood. Pack recognizes pack. He'll know his parents." They reached Thera's Rest just after sunrise. It was a small village, maybe 30 buildings clustered around a central square. Peaceful, quiet. The kind of place where nothing significant ever happened. The kind of place where you could hide a prince. The widow Thea's cottage was on the eastern edge of the village, marked by a small garden and a wooden fence. As the carriage rolled to a stop in front of it, they heard it, the sound of a child laughing. Kalista was out of the carriage before it fully stopped, following that sound like it was calling her soul home. Alexandros was right behind her, his hand gripping hers so tightly it hurt. They found him in the garden behind the cottage. A small boy with dark curly hair, chasing a chicken while an older woman watched with fond exasperation. The child was maybe 3 feet tall, sturdy and healthy, with a smile that could light up the world. And when he turned at the sound of their approach, they saw it clearly. Alexandros's strong jaw, Callista's gentle eyes, and an expression that was uniquely, perfectly his own. Their son. Their Niklos. The widow, Thea, saw them and went pale, recognizing royal authority even if she didn't recognize faces. "I can explain," she started, her voice shaking. "I didn't know, I was told he was an orphan." But Callista wasn't listening. She was moving toward the child, dropping to her knees in the dirt, tears streaming down her face. "Niklos," she whispered. The boy looked at her curiously, head tilted. He'd been told his name was Miklos, had grown up thinking the widow was his mother. But something in Callista's voice, in her scent, in the way she looked at him. Blood recognized blood. "Mama," he said, the word uncertain but instinctive. Callista sobbed and opened her arms. Niklos hesitated only a moment before walking into them, letting this strange woman who smelled right and felt safe wrap him in a desperate embrace. Alexandros knelt beside them, his large hand gentle on his son's dark curls. The boy looked up at him with wide eyes. Alpha recognized Alpha, even at 3 years old. Father and son stared at each other, two parts of the same soul meeting for the first time in their conscious memory. "Papa," Niklos said, trying out the word. "Yes," Alexandros managed through the tears he couldn't stop. "Yes, I'm your papa. And we've been looking for you for so long." They stayed there in the dirt, the three of them wrapped together, while the guards kept a respectful distance and Thea wept on her porch, understanding that she was losing the child she'd come to love as her own. Later there would be explanations. Thea would tell them everything. How Lysandra had brought the baby to her, how she'd been told he was unwanted, how the gold had been both payment and insurance of silence. She would beg forgiveness for her part in it, even unknowing. Later there would be the journey home, with Niklos confused but adapting with the resilience of young children. There would be the public revelation that the heir lived, that he was home, that the kingdom's grief had been based on lies. Later there would be Lysandra's trial, where she would be found guilty of every charge and sentenced to permanent exile beyond Pac lands, marked as rogue, forbidden from ever returning on pain of death. Later there would be the slow process of healing, the bond between Alexandros and Callista growing strong again, the trust rebuilding, the scars fading. There would be Niklos learning who he really was, adjusting to palace life, slowly remembering the mother who'd held him in his first 3 months, even if he couldn't consciously recall it. Later there would be reforms to Pac law, ensuring no one could weaponize ancient clauses against innocent victims again. There would be a formal apology from the council to Callista, though no apology could ever be enough. Later there would be life, messy and complicated and healing, but life. But in that moment, in the garden of a humble cottage in a forgotten village, there was only reunion. Only a family torn apart being stitched back together by love and blood and the unbreakable bonds of fate. Kalista held her son and felt the gaping wound in her soul begin to close. Alexandros wrapped his arms around both of them and felt the emptiness that had haunted him for 2 years fill with light. And Niklos, young enough to adapt but old enough to sense the importance of this moment, held on to both of them and felt truly safe for the first time in a way he couldn't explain. "Let's go home," Alexandros said finally, his voice rough with emotion. And for the first time in 2 years, Kalista could say honestly, "Yes, let's go home." The carriage carried them back toward the palace, toward the life that had been stolen and was now reclaimed. The kingdom that had mourned would celebrate. The Omega who'd been condemned would be vindicated. The Alpha who'd doubted would spend the rest of his life making amends. And the child at the center of it all, the innocent heir whose existence had been weaponized by jealousy and hatred, would grow up knowing he was loved fiercely by both his parents. He would grow up knowing that his mother had never stopped searching for him, had risked everything to bring him home. He would grow up knowing that his father had moved heaven and earth the moment he knew the truth. He would grow up surrounded by proof that love, real love, doesn't break. It bends, it stretches, it survives even the cruelest attempts to destroy it. And he would grow up to be a king who understood the weight of justice, the importance of truth, and the power of mercy, because he'd been both victim and survivor of a crime that taught him all three. But that was a story for another time. For now, there was only the journey home, the reunion, and the beginning of healing for a family that had survived their worst nightmare. Because in the end, jealousy had tried to destroy them. Lies had nearly succeeded. Doubt had wounded them deeply. But love, fated, fierce, and unbreakable love, had won. And that, more than any crown or throne or kingdom, was what truly mattered.